the question for this next little session is, what's special about this symphony? We talked last time about what's a symphony. And it's in the context of knowing what people thought a symphony was that this piece will have had its special effects. And of course, still does, for those of us who know a lot of symphonies. It's Mr. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and it was performed in May of 1824. But there are a number of things that might be worth pointing out about the unusual aspects of this symphony, many of which you already know about. One is its very large size. It's a really long symphony, at least for that time. Since then, Mahler and Bruckner and others have written longer symphonies, but this was a very long symphony compared to the standard sort of symphony. What you can't see on the blackboard is me writing out the timings of the 4 movements of Mozart's 40th Symphony over here in minutes and seconds from a recording that seems to me a plausible recording. That is of the symphony whose first movement we just listened to, and the timings of the movements of Beethoven's symphony. And you can see that by and large, Beethoven's is much bigger. I've put the Beethoven movements in the wrong order for a reason that I'll explain and that many of you will know. But Mozart's first movement is 7 minutes and 20 seconds long, whereas Beethoven's is just about twice that long. In the same sort of shape, but twice as long. The slow movements are about equal. Mozart's minuet is 4 minutes, and Beethoven's dance movement, Beethoven's minuet, which he calls a scherzo, is 14 minutes long. And then, as is usual, Mozart's last movement is relatively short, not usually longer than the first movement, and sometimes quite a lot shorter, 7 minutes and a little bit. Beethoven's is 23 minutes long or so, just the last movement. That is, it's longer than some whole symphonies. And the whole thing put together is really long compared for a symphony. And this is a very standard-sized symphony for Mozart and Haydn and their contemporaries. This is a very long symphony by their standards and by almost any other standards up to that time. Richard Wagner, the great opera conductor, wrote a whole book about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, as many people have, and he saw it as the great piece of music leading the way to the future. And he said about this symphony, Wagner said, "The last symphony of Beethoven is the redemption of music from out of her own particular element into the realm of universal art. It is the human gospel of the art of the future. Beyond it, no forward step is possible, for upon it, the perfect artwork of the future alone can follow. The universal drama to which Beethoven has forged for us the key." Now, that's Mr. Wagner saying, instrumental music can go no farther. The only thing that's possible is universal drama. And guess who's going to take care of that? On the other hand, he does see this as sort of a summit point. Mr. Beethoven and Mr. Wagner might be unhappy at some of the things that tune gets used for. Did you know a film called The Clockwork Orange? Have you seen the ads for Ford Explorers? There's a new ad for Ford Explorers that has that. I was in a hotel room in Ohio last weekend and looking for Sesame Street, as I always do, and failing to find it, I saw an ad for the local cable company that went, "More new movies, more new movies, more new movies." It's not always a good thing to be an icon. But it has mattered a lot. Remember, of course, that Beethoven didn't know this was his last symphony. He didn't know this was going to happen, but he did care about it. He chose this poem, and I think the poem he chose to set to music in the last, or a part of which he chose to set to music in the last movement, contains the message that he wants us to have, and it's very difficult to translate in today's diverse world. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All God's children should be siblings. or something like that. It doesn't translate into inclusive language very well. All men should be brothers. That's the message. And it has worked in a way. It still means that to all of us. This was a very standard thing for people to do, and Schiller's Ode to Joy is just such a drinking poem. I've distributed to you the original text and a translation by David Levy of that song. And I've also given you an indication of which sections of it Beethoven chooses and the order he chooses to put them in. But if you read the whole text, and I'm not sure that you need to do it now, you will find lots and lots and lots of references to drinking. On the second page of the song there, on the second page of your handout, on the left-hand side there, the sort of third verse, joy sparkles in goblets in the golden blood of grapes, and down, brothers, up from your places when the full glass goes around. Let the foam now spray to heaven, this glass to the good spirit. So yes, it's an ode to joy, but it's also an ode to joy that's a very long toast. Bring the holy circle closer, swear by this golden wine. Brothers, drink to this accord, and things of that sort. Interestingly, Beethoven takes the words of a drinking song and makes it into, he chooses his words carefully, there are not many toasts in the Ninth Symphony, takes the words of this sort of Gesellschaftslied and makes it into a universal statement and places it in the most incongruous context, in a way, in the greatest and longest symphony that ever had been, with a universal message for mankind. Francis Scott Key takes the tune of a drinking song, probably because people would know it and could sing along, though it's, I wish he'd chosen the tune from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it just wasn't available yet, and sets to it a patriotic hymn about seeing the flag flying in Baltimore through the artillery fire. So they are connected. Their tunes couldn't be more different, but their origin in some ways is similar, and each has to do with the conversion of one thing into some grand other thing. And they happen at about the same time. Schiller wrote his Ode to Joy at the end of the 18th century, and so did Francis Scott Key. So it's a piece of contemporary literature, and we maybe want to bear that in mind when thinking about Beethoven doing that, because his audience will have known this poem. It was written by Schiller, a great poet, as on the model of one of these drinking songs, but I'm not sure he really intended it to be sung with a bunch of guys with big beer steins around a table. I think he meant us to understand that it's the transformation, the transfiguration of songs of that type, in the same way that Beethoven's symphony is also a transfiguration of it. Whereas Beethoven's symphony is in 4 movements, and we're used to symphonies being in 4 movements if we are concert goers of the early 19th century. But actually, writing pieces in traditional numbers of movements is sort of unusual for Beethoven at this time. He was experimenting with all sorts of things having to do with a large number of shorter movements, or a smaller number of longer movements, and to do a standard number of movements is standard for the time, but a little bit unusual for Beethoven. I don't know quite why he does this rather than something else, but he wants to stay in the symphonic genre that people will understand. Nevertheless, the symphony begins in a way that lets you know right from the opening sound something about its size. We heard that beginning, that sort of cosmic beginning, where little atoms come together to make something. And that takes a while for that to happen. And somehow, the beginning of the symphony sets the time scale. Mozart goes right into the tune. Beethoven shows us how you assemble a tune out of the basic elements of universal music, which are essentially sound and time. And the sound of the beginning of the symphony, I think, gives us a very clear idea that this is going to be something on a cosmic scale. So it comes as no surprise when the symphony turns out to be this long, and it seems clear that Beethoven knew from the very beginning that he was going to write a symphony on an unparalleled scale. Another thing, of course, that's unusual about this symphony, and the thing that makes it stand out in almost all our minds, is the fact that it's not a piece for symphony orchestra. It's a piece for symphony orchestra, vocal soloists, and chorus. Not so unusual later, because this symphony exists and other people say, oh, Berlioz says, I could do that in my Romeo and Juliet, and Mahler says that I could do that in my Second Symphony, and so on and so on. Another thing about this piece is that it has a sort of an overall psychology. I don't mean to say that Mozart's symphony doesn't have a basic overall psychology of something substantial, something lyrical, something restful, and something upbeat. That's a kind of psychology, but this has a psychology that really leads us from the beginning all the way to the end, it seems to me. And it's true of a lot of Beethoven's music from this time. There's a sense of sort of struggle and achieving some kind of triumph as a result of that struggle. And we know how triumphant the end of the symphony is. People say, Symphony number 9 in D minor. Well, and yet it ends. How does it end? It's all this, those of you who are music experts, is that a minor key? No. So it's customary, although you use different keys in the different movements of a symphony, it's customary to do the same sort of key adventure in the course of a symphony that you do in the course of a movement. That is, in this first movement of Mozart that we heard, he starts in one key, goes to another, gets things all confused, and comes back to the home key. The same thing happens in a symphony. You customarily come back to the home key, so you have a sense of closure. Beethoven comes back to what's not quite the home key, but the triumphant, transformed version of the home key. And not only that, but all sorts of other things give us evidence that he's really thinking about the psychology of the whole symphony. Whereas in a Mozart and Haydn symphony, the weight tends to be, the most serious, solid movement tends to be the first movement. And then other things, lyrical movement, dance movement, upbeat, final movement, they're all very nice, but the weight is at the beginning. Beethoven shifts the weight of this symphony towards the end in two ways. One is the obvious one, that this last movement is almost as long as all the rest of the symphony put together, which is not usual for last movements, to put all that weight there. And the other thing is this shifting of the two interior movements. That is, you might remember this, in Beethoven's symphony, the second movement is the dance movement. He calls it a scherzo, but it's sort of speeded up minuet. And it's the third movement that is the lyrical slow movement. So in a way, it also has the effect of putting more weight towards the end. So that this is a thing that is moving in a certain direction rather than starting off somewhere and sort of relaxing afterwards. One of the interesting things that it does, as you probably know, is that the last movement quotes all the previous movements. Do you know about that, how he does that? There's sort of, the cellos talk and say, no, not this, no, not that. No, not this other thing, something else, we want something else. Something else, and the cello says, oh yeah, more like that. And then finally, they say, yes, do that, and then the tune starts. I don't want to overstate the case for any of these particular ways of thinking about the last movement, but something that's 23 minutes long has got to be thought about in some way other than note, 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 note. And so it's like a recitative and aria, it's like a cantata, it's like a concerto, and it's like a symphony in itself. And it's like nothing else in the world. All at the same time, which is pretty remarkable. And we'll come back and think quite a lot more about how it works and what happens in it. But it's worth, the point of all of this is just to think about the very unique, not very unique, the unique qualities of this symphony, having to do with its unusual size, its shifting of weight towards the end, and the remarkable size of the last movement, and the fact that the symphony as a whole is a single musical progression, a single psychological event.